The afternoon the Calloway brothers rode into Dusty Creek and declared they were selling off two Leland sisters like cattle at a county fair. Every soul in that saloon had the good sense to look away. Every soul, that is, except for the quiet cowboy sitting alone at the back table, nursing a glass of lukewarm coffee and watching the whole ugly scene unfold with eyes the color of a winter storm. Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, was not a town that prided itself on decency. It sat along the edge of the Llano Estacado like a bad tooth in a good jaw, populated by drifters and ranchers, gamblers and merchants, all of them chasing something the land had not yet promised to give them. The main street was a long stretch of packed earth that turned to mud when the rains came and cracked like old pottery when they did not. There was one general store run by a man named Hobbs who watered down his molasses and never apologized for it. There was a livery, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, a telegraph office that received more bad news than good, and the Silver Spur Saloon, which was where most of the town's decisions, arguments, and regrettable agreements took place. It was in the Silver Spur that Hazel Leland stood on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, trying very hard not to let her chin tremble. She was 22 years old, the elder of the two Leland sisters, and she had spent the better part of those 22 years being told, in one way or another, that she was not quite enough, not pretty enough, not soft enough, not quiet enough. Her hair was a deep chestnut that refused to stay pinned, her nose had a slight bump from a fall off a horse at age 9, and her eyes were a striking amber green that people occasionally called unusual when they meant to say something unkind. She was lean and sun-darkened from real work, with calloused hands and a straight back that she had learned to hold like armor. The townspeople of Dusty Creek called her plain-faced. The Calloway brothers called her worse. Her younger sister, Clara, was 19 and had the kind of pale prettiness that made men go stupid. Clara had their mother's fair skin and their father's light eyes, and she had grown up being told she was beautiful so often that she believed it with a quiet, anxious faith. Clara was not cruel, but she was scared, and right now she was standing beside Hazel in the Silver Spur with her hands clasped together and her eyes cast at the floor. The Calloway brothers, Denton and Ray, were their mother's cousins, and they had arrived in Dusty Creek 3 days after their parents' funeral with a wagon, a bill of sale, and the kind of cheerful cruelty that comes from men who have never once been told no. Their parents, James and Eliza Leland, had died of fever within a week of each other in early April, leaving the small Leland homestead, a modest herd of cattle, and 2 unmarried daughters to whatever fate saw fit. The law in 1878 was not designed to protect women in situations like this one, and the Calloways knew it. Denton Calloway was 35, thick-necked and loud, with the ruddy complexion of a man who drank more than he should and the confidence of a man who had never suffered real consequences. He stood in the middle of the Silver Spur with his hat pushed back on his head and his thumbs hooked in his belt like he owned the entire state of Texas. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing the room the way a circus barker addresses a crowd, "we find ourselves in a situation of some opportunity." The saloon was half full on a Tuesday afternoon. There were 4 men at the card table, 2 at the bar, a few scattered at the other tables, and the bartender, a lean man named Pete, who had the tired expression of someone who had seen everything and been impressed by none of it. Denton gestured broadly toward Clara and Hazel. "These 2 ladies are in need of husbands. Their parents, God rest them, left behind some debt, and it falls to me and my brother Ray to see that the matter is resolved in a practical fashion. Clara there is a fine-looking girl, gentle and obedient, and she'll make some lucky man a good wife. Whoever takes her gets the bonus of helping settle a modest debt and securing a hardworking partner." There was some murmuring. A man at the card table sat up a little straighter. Ray Calloway, the younger brother and the more quietly mean of the 2, stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Now," he said, "the other one, Hazel, she's not much to look at, so we're prepared to sweeten that arrangement considerably. Whoever takes or gets the east pasture of the Leland land, free and clear, along with the small herd. It's a business arrangement, gentlemen. Nothing complicated about it." Ray looked at his brother and smirked. "Take the ugly one," he said, low and casual, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world, "and you walk away with the better deal." The words landed in the room like a stone into still water. A few men laughed, brief and uncomfortable. The card players exchanged glances. Pete the bartender studied the bar top with sudden intensity. No one spoke up. Hazel did not move. She held her spine straight and her chin level, and she stared at the middle distance with the focused expression of someone who is fighting to keep all of their feeling locked inside their chest where it cannot be used against them. She could feel Clara trembling beside her, could feel the heat in her own face, could feel the particular shame that comes from being publicly dismissed, publicly reduced, publicly made into something that requires sweetening to be worth the trouble. She had grown up hearing versions of this. She had grown up watching Clara be chosen first for everything: dances, introductions, conversations, while she stood slightly behind, managing the logistics, solving the practical problems, being useful in the ways that nobody celebrated. She had made peace with certain aspects of her situation. She had not made peace with being stood up in a saloon and offered like livestock. And still no one spoke. The man at the card table, a rancher named Burkett who had a wife back home and absolutely no shame about his interest in Clara, cleared his throat. "I might consider the pretty one," he said, which told everyone present that he had not understood the assignment of basic human dignity. Denton Calloway grinned. "Now we're talking business." It was at this precise moment that a chair scraped back from the table in the far corner. The sound was not dramatic. It was simply the sound of a chair moving on wooden floorboards, but something about it cut through the noise of the room in a way that made everyone turn to look. Edgar Slater stood up slowly. He was 28 years old, tall and spare in the way of men who work hard and eat honestly, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that had not seen a razor in 4 or 5 days. He had arrived in Dusty Creek 2 weeks ago looking for work, had found a temporary position helping out at the Brennan Ranch on the south edge of town, and had otherwise kept entirely to himself. He ate his meals quietly, did his work without complaint, and spent his evenings at the back corner table of the Silver Spur with coffee or occasionally something stronger, reading whatever book he had managed to acquire. He was the kind of man people stopped noticing after a few days because he created no trouble and demanded no attention. But now he was standing up. He had gray eyes, the particular gray of storm clouds building on the flat horizon, and right now they were fixed on Denton Calloway with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite contempt, but something quieter and more serious than either. He walked forward from the back of the room. His boots were worn but clean. He moved without hurry, which somehow made the room feel more still than it had a moment ago. He stopped at the edge of the open floor space where the Calloway brothers had set up their ugly little market, and he looked at Hazel Leland directly, which was a thing that almost no one in this room had done yet. "I'll take her," he said. His voice was even. There was no performance in it. He was not making a speech or trying to be heroic. He was simply stating a fact in the tone of a man who has made a decision and sees no reason to dress it up. The room went very quiet. Denton Calloway stared at him. "You talking about Hazel?" "I am," Edgar said. "You heard the terms, the pasture, the herd, the debt." "I heard them." Ray Calloway studied Edgar with the narrow-eyed calculation of a man trying to figure out if he was being tricked. "You sure you don't want to reconsider the other?" "I'm sure," Edgar said, and the simplicity of it closed that line of conversation like a door. Hazel turned her head to look at him for the first time. She did not know him. She knew she had seen him in the saloon once or twice, had placed him vaguely as one of the new ranch hands, but she had never spoken to him and could not have named him if asked yesterday. She looked at him now with an expression she was not entirely in control of, something between disbelief and a desperate, cautious hope that she did not yet trust. He was not looking at her with pity. That was the first thing she noted. He was not looking at her with the soft, sorry expression of a man doing charity. He was looking at her with directness and something that might have been steadiness, and she could not immediately determine what to do with that. "You got money for the debt?" Denton asked. "I have $40. The rest I'll pay from wages over the next year." "You got steady work?" "I've got a standing offer from Brennan," Edgar said, which was true. Jacob Brennan had been trying to bring him on full-time since the first week. "And once I've got the east pasture and the herd, I won't need wages long." Denton looked at Ray. Ray shrugged in the manner of a man who does not particularly care about the details as long as he gets what he wants. "All right," Denton said, and stuck out his hand. Edgar shook it once firmly without smiling. It was done. Hazel stood in the Silver Spur Saloon on a Tuesday afternoon in 1878 and tried to understand that she had just been agreed upon by two men she did not know, which was horrifying, and that one of those men had stood up in a room full of people who said nothing and claimed her without cruelty, which was something else entirely, something she did not have a clean word for yet. Clara caught her hand in the crowd and squeezed it. "Hazel," she whispered. Clara's own arrangement with Burkett had dissolved the moment Edgar stood up, which seemed to have rattled Denton considerably, but that was a problem for later. Right now Clara's eyes were wide and a little tearful and very focused on her sister. "Are you all right?" "I don't know yet," Hazel said honestly. Edgar Slater was standing a few feet away, speaking quietly with Denton about the paperwork, and Hazel looked at his profile, the straight line of his nose, the set of his jaw, the way he held himself without the exaggerated swagger that so many men in this territory seemed to think was required, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, "He is a stranger. He is a complete stranger, and he is about to become my husband." The thought was terrifying. The thought was also, underneath the terror, carrying a thread of something warmer that she was not yet ready to examine. The wedding took place 4 days later in the little church on Main Street, performed by Reverend Alcott, who was a decent man of 50 with the brisk manner of someone who has presided over many ceremonies of varying levels of sentiment. There were no guests to speak of. Clara was there, holding a small bunch of wild prairie flowers she had gathered that morning, with the serious dedication of someone who believes that flowers can fix the inadequacy of a situation. Pete the bartender came because he was curious, and because he respected Edgar for reasons he could not entirely articulate. Jacob Brennan attended out of what appeared to be straightforward goodwill. Hazel wore the best dress she owned, which was a deep blue wool that had seen better days but was clean and fitted, and she had managed to do something with her hair that was not exactly elegant but was at least intentional. She stood beside Edgar Slater at the front of the church and felt as though she were standing at the edge of a very high cliff, looking down at something that might be water or might be rock, unable to tell from this distance. Edgar wore a clean white shirt, a dark vest, and the expression of a man who was taking this with absolute seriousness. Reverend Alcott said the words. They said theirs. Edgar's voice was steady throughout. Hazel's voice was steady too, though she had to work for it. When it was over, they walked out into the April sunshine and stood on the church steps for a moment side by side, not touching, both looking at the dusty street ahead of them. "I have a room at the boarding house," Edgar said. "It's small. I'd understand if you'd rather stay at the homestead for now and let me sleep in the barn until you're more comfortable." Hazel looked at him. "You do that? It seems reasonable." "We don't know each other." She considered this. It was, in fact, the most reasonable thing anyone had said to her in days. It was also the kind of thing she had not expected, and the unexpectedness of it loosened something in her chest slightly. "The homestead," she said. Yes, that would be better." He nodded as though this was settled and entirely satisfactory. "Then let's get your things and go see what we're working with." They rode out to the Leland homestead that afternoon, Edgar on his bay gelding, Hazel on the dappled gray mare that had been her horse since she was 15. The homestead was a modest piece of land 2 miles east of town, a main house, a barn, a chicken coop, a vegetable garden that had been let go in the weeks of illness and mourning, and the east pasture beyond the fence line, where the small herd of 18 cattle grazed without much supervision. Edgar rode the perimeter of the property without saying much, looking at the fences, checking the water situation at the stock pond, examining the barn's condition. Hazel followed and watched him assess things with the practical eye of someone who actually knew about land and livestock, and she felt the first small loosening of a tension she had been carrying for weeks. Her parents had been good people and hard workers, but there had not been a man on this property to lift the heavier work in some time, and things had accumulated. She knew what was needed. She had been trying to figure out how to manage it alone. "The north fence section needs replacing," Edgar said, standing at the fence line with his hands on a post, testing its stability. "That section there has been pushed by cattle, and it'll go down in the next hard rain. The stock pond needs clearing. There's a log jam on the inlet side. The barn roof has lost some boards on the west face." "I know," she said. "I've been making a list." He looked at her. "You have an actual list?" "In my head mostly, some on paper." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one, like sunlight moving behind a cloud. "Show me." She showed him. They sat at the kitchen table in the homestead's main house in the late afternoon, and she laid out what she knew: the fence sections, the roof, the depleted firewood supply, the state of the cattle, the vegetable garden's needs, the account at Hobbs's store. Edgar listened without interrupting, asked 4 sharp, practical questions, and then looked at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. "You've been managing all of this yourself since your parents took ill," he said. It was not a question exactly. She answered it anyway. "Yes." While grieving, she looked at the table. There wasn't time to do it in any particular order. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry about your parents, Miss Leland." "Hazel," she said, because it seemed absurd to be called Miss Leland by her own husband, even a husband she had known for 4 days. "Please, just Hazel." "Hazel," he said, and the single word in his voice, said simply, without ceremony, did something to her that she was not prepared for. She kept her expression very still. "Edgar," she said in return, and he nodded. That was the beginning of it, though neither of them would have described it in those terms at the time. Edgar set up in the barn as promised, and Hazel kept to the house, and they established a rhythm of shared work that was, in its way, its own kind of intimacy. He rose before dawn and had the stove lit in the kitchen before she came down, leaving coffee in the pot without comment. She made breakfast for both of them and left a covered plate if she was working outside before he came in. They worked the property in parallel and sometimes together, and by the end of the first week she had started to understand the shape of him as a person. He was quiet in a way that was not coldness. He was steady in a way that was not blankness. He had opinions. She discovered this when the cattle fence discussion turned into a real disagreement about which method of post-installation was more durable, and he held his ground without becoming loud or dismissive. And when she made a point he could not counter, he said, "You're right about that," in a tone of complete neutrality that contained no wounded pride. She was so startled by this that she dropped her hammer. He picked it up and handed it back to her. "You know fencing," he said. "My father taught me. He taught you well." She took the hammer and went back to work, and tried not to let the warmth of a simple compliment sit in her chest like a coal, but it did anyway. Clara came out to the homestead twice in the first week, ostensibly to help but really to look at Edgar with the cautious, measuring expression of a younger sister, evaluating a situation she cannot quite classify. On her second visit she found Hazel alone in the garden and crouched down beside her in the dirt and whispered, "He seems good, Hazel." "I think he might actually be good." "I think he might be," Hazel agreed carefully, "but I've known him 10 days. That's more than some people get." This was true. This was exactly the kind of truth that the year 1878 in West Texas made you live with. Hazel knew it. She pulled up a weed with more force than necessary and did not answer. What happened with Clara's situation was this. Denton Calloway, robbed of his clean transaction when his arrangement with Burkett fell apart, had tried to push the matter again by introducing Clara to a widower in a neighboring town named Fitch, who was 53 years old and had 3 children who needed tending and zero warmth in his eyes. Clara had refused, quietly and firmly, and had told her sister about it with a pale face and set jaw, and Hazel had gone to find Edgar. She found him at the water trough, cleaning out the inlet pipe, and she told him what had happened with the flatness of someone reporting a practical problem that requires a practical solution. Edgar straightened up and dried his hands on his trousers and thought about it for a moment. What does Clara want? The question surprised her. What does she want? Yes. Not what does Denton want, not what would solve the immediate problem. What does Clara want? Hazel looked at him. She wants to stay in Dusty Creek. She wants to not be married off to a 53-year-old stranger. She wants to be allowed to make her own choices eventually. Does she have any means? Any skills she could use to support herself in the short term while we deal with Calloway? Hazel thought about it. She sews very well, better than anyone in town, I'd say. Then she should talk to Mrs. Hale at the dry goods annex. Mrs. Hale's been taking in mending herself for lack of anyone better. Clara could take that work, have her own income, and we can handle the Calloway situation through the law rather than through accommodation. Hazel stared at him. Through the law. I spoke with Deputy Marsh last week about something else. He mentioned that Calloway has an outstanding debt dispute in Abilene County that's been flagged as a potential fraud. If Marsh was made aware that Calloway is attempting to force arrangements here that might also constitute coercion, it puts Calloway in a position where he needs to leave quietly rather than risk the flag being escalated. He paused. It's not a guaranteed solution, but it's a better one than letting Clara be handed to a stranger she doesn't want. Hazel was quiet for a long moment. The late afternoon sun was laying gold across the pasture, and a hawk was circling over the east fence line, and the world was very still. You figured all of that out about Calloway on your own. It's useful to know who you're dealing with. You didn't say anything to me. I didn't know if you'd want me involved. It seemed overstepping before you came to me. She looked at him for a long moment, at the water inlet in his hand, at the muddy knees of his trousers, at his face which was turned toward the pasture and not performing anything. Thank you, she said, for handling things properly. He nodded once and went back to the inlet pipe. She went back to the house and sat at the kitchen table for a while without doing anything. She had been afraid of this arrangement. She had been braced for it to be bad in the way that arrangements forced by circumstance tend to be bad, distant at best, miserable at worst. She had been steeling herself for a man who would take the property and treat her like part of the transaction, or a man who would be kind in a condescending way that felt like charity, or any of the dozen other versions of this that she had imagined in the days between the saloon and the wedding. She had not imagined this. She had not imagined a man who asked what Clara wanted. She pressed her hand flat against the table and breathed. Edgar did speak to Deputy Marsh. Marsh, to his credit, was a fair man who took the conversation seriously, and within the week Denton Calloway received a message that convinced him that Dusty Creek was not, at present, the best location for his particular brand of business. The Calloways left on a Thursday morning with their wagon and their debts and their small, mean smirks, and Clara watched them go from the window of Mrs. Hale's shop, where she had started the previous Monday, and felt the specific freedom of a weight being removed from one's shoulders. Edgar never mentioned it to Hazel directly after the fact. He did not take credit for it in any form. She knew what had happened because Deputy Marsh mentioned it in passing 2 weeks later with an approving nod toward Edgar, and she filed this information away with the other things she was accumulating about her husband, the collection growing in her chest like something planted that she had not planned on and did not know yet how to manage. May came. The prairie turned green where it could and gold where it could not, and the Texas sky was enormous and relentless. And there were days when the beauty of the flat land under the wide sky struck Hazel like something physical, which had been true since she was a girl but felt sharper now for some reason she kept not looking at directly. Edgar fixed the north fence. He cleared the stock pond inlet. He replaced the boards on the west face of the barn roof on a bright Tuesday morning, and Hazel held the ladder steady at the bottom and handed up the nails when he needed them. And at one point he leaned down from the roof with his hand out, and she placed a handful of nails into his palm, and their fingers touched for just a moment. Not even a moment. A half moment. The briefest possible contact. And she became intensely focused on the horizon. "Can you see the pond from up there?" she called. "Clearly," he said. "The inlet's running clean. You were right about the placement." She had been right about the placement, and he had said so easily, and she was 22 years old, standing in the May sunshine and trying to be serious about barn roofs. In the evenings they had taken to sitting on the porch after supper. This had started without being planned, as the best habits often do. She had taken her coffee out to watch the sunset on the third evening, and he had come out with his and leaned on the porch railing, and they had been quiet together for 20 minutes in a way that had been entirely comfortable. And then they had talked about the cattle for a while, and it had become a thing they did. They talked about practical matters first, always the state of the herd, the plans for the next week, the news from town when one of them had been in. But underneath the practical matters, other things began to surface gradually, like objects coming up from underwater as the light changes. He told her one evening about growing up in Missouri, about a father who had been a carpenter and a mother who had read to him from whatever books she could find, about leaving at 17 to come west because Missouri had felt suddenly very small after his father died. He told her these things without drama, in the quiet way of someone who is comfortable with their own history, and she listened in the same way she had listened to him talk about fence posts, which was to say carefully and with complete attention. She told him, on a different evening, about her parents, about her mother, who had been sharp and funny and had taught her to ride before she taught her to read, about her father, who had loved this land specifically, this particular piece of West Texas, and had said more than once that the flatness of it was not emptiness but openness, which was a different thing. She told him about the last months before the fever and the fever itself, and the 2 weeks between her mother's death and her father's, and she told him without tears, though tears would have been appropriate because she had already spent them in private. Edgar listened. He did not say it would be all right or offer any comfort that was too large to be real. When she finished, he said, "He was right about the flatness. It is openness." And she looked at the horizon and the low evening light, and knew that she was in very serious trouble. June brought heat and the promise of a good summer if the rain held, and it brought something else too, which was the realization, arriving slowly and then all at once, that Edgar Slater had moved from the barn to the house. This had happened gradually and practically. The barn had a bad spring storm go through it in late May that had damaged one of the walls, and while it was repaired, it was drafty and damp, and Hazel had said sensibly that there was a second bedroom in the house and he should use it, which was the practical and obvious solution, and he had said thank you and moved his things in, and the house felt different after that. Not uncomfortable. Different in the way that a room feels different when something is added to it that belongs. She was aware of him in a way that had nothing to do with inconvenience. She was aware of the sound of him moving in the kitchen in the early morning. She was aware of his voice when he talked to the horses in the yard. She was aware of the fact that he sometimes smiled at things she said, not a big smile, a contained one that involved his eyes more than his mouth, and that she had started, without fully meaning to say things she thought might produce that smile because she wanted to see it. She was 22 years old and she was married to a man she had not chosen, and she was falling in love with him, which she recognized as either the best or worst thing that had ever happened to her, and she was not yet sure which. The problem was this: she did not know what he felt. He was kind and steady and present, and he treated her with a respect that was consistent and not performative. And sometimes she caught him looking at her with an expression she could not fully read, something that seemed, in the moment before he looked away, like more than practicality. But he had never said anything that confirmed this. He had been perfectly, courteously distant in all of the right ways, and she could not tell if this was because he felt nothing beyond responsibility and decency, or because he felt something and was, like her, waiting. Clara was no help. When Hazel finally told her, on a Wednesday afternoon in late June, that she thought she might be falling in love with Edgar, Clara put down her sewing and looked at her with the expression of someone receiving information that is surprising only in its delay. "Hazel," Clara said, "I know. You know what? I have watched you two sit on that porch for the past 6 weeks. I have seen the way you look at him when he talks about the cattle. I have absolutely noticed that you've started wearing your good blouse on days when you're just working around the homestead." Hazel opened her mouth, then closed it. "The question," Clara said, picking her sewing back up with the practical air of someone who has made her point, "is what are you going to do about it?" "I don't know what to do about it." "You could tell him. Clara, we are married, not by choice, by circumstance, by a transaction in a saloon that was degrading for both of us. What if she stopped, started again. What if he feels nothing of the kind, and it makes things strange between us, and we still have to live on this property together and work together and what if he does feel something," Clara said gently, "and you spend 10 more years on that porch being courteous at each other?" Hazel did not have a good answer for this. The answer came from a direction she had not expected, as real things often do. It was the first week of July, a Saturday, which was the day Edgar went into town for supplies and to deal with any ranch business. Hazel had stayed home to tend to the garden and start a pot of stew for supper. She had been working in the garden for 2 hours when she heard the horse coming up the road faster than a walk, and she looked up to see Edgar riding the bay at a pace that meant something had happened. He pulled up at the yard gate and dismounted in one smooth motion, and she could see that he was holding his left arm slightly away from his body. "What happened?" she said, already moving toward him. "Nothing significant," he said, which is what a man says when something is significant and he doesn't want to make a fuss. "Saddle slipped on the way back. Horse spooked at something in the road. I came off. It's fine." "Let me see." "Hazel, it's Edgar." She used his name the way she had heard her mother use her father's name when she meant stop arguing and let me help you. She didn't realize until she'd said it that she'd used that exact tone. He stopped arguing and let her help him. She got him into the kitchen and helped him out of his vest and rolled up his sleeve and examined the arm with the competent, focused hands of a woman who had patched up animals and people both and knew what she was doing. It was a deep bruise and a nasty scrape across the forearm and a wrist that was swollen but not broken when she tested the movement carefully. "You're lucky," she said. "I know. You could have broken it. I know that too." She was cleaning the scrape with water and the small supply of carbolic solution she kept in the medicine cabinet, and he was sitting very still at the kitchen table with his arm extended, and the afternoon light was coming through the west window at a low angle and everything was very quiet. She was concentrating on what she was doing and not looking at his face, so she did not see the expression that was there, but she felt him watching her. "Hazel," he said. "Hold still, I'm not done." "Hazel." Something in his voice made her look up. He was looking at her the way she had been trying to read for the past 2 months, and now that she was close and looking directly, she could read it perfectly, and it was exactly what she had hoped and feared. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. "And I've been trying to figure out the right time, and I've been telling myself to wait until we knew each other better, until you were more settled, until the situation felt less, until it felt like something you'd chosen rather than something that happened to you. But I think if I wait any longer I'm going to be telling this to the cattle instead of you, and that's not practical." She set down the cloth very carefully. Her heart was doing something that was not medically advisable. "Tell me," she said. "I came into that saloon 6 weeks ago as a man who had no particular attachment to anything. I came in for coffee, and I saw something happen that was wrong in such a specific and clear way that I couldn't sit and watch it." He paused. "And then I got up and I saw your face and you were holding yourself so steady, in the middle of all of it, not crumbling, not asking for sympathy, just standing there with your back straight and your chin up, and I thought. He stopped, looked at the table for a moment. I thought, whoever this woman is, she deserves better than this room is offering her. That was the first thought. The second thought came later. What was the second thought? His eyes met hers. That I wanted to be the one who gave her better. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a mockingbird was going through its repertoire in the post oak by the barn, cycling through half a dozen songs with the confident energy of a creature who loves its own voice. "Edgar," she said. Her voice came out slightly different than she intended, slightly less contained. "I know this isn't simple," he said. "I know you didn't choose me. I know this started as a transaction that shouldn't have been a transaction, and I'm not asking you for anything you don't want to give. But I think I should tell you the truth rather than keep it from you, because you've been honest with me since the beginning and you deserve the same." She reached across the table and covered his unbandaged hand with hers. His hand was large and roughened from work and warm, and she felt him go very still the moment she touched him. "I chose you," she said, "maybe not in the Silver Spur, but in every conversation on that porch, and every morning you left coffee in the pot, and every time you asked what Clara wanted instead of what was convenient. I chose you in every one of those moments. They just accumulated until it was obvious." He turned his hand under hers and held it. They sat like that for a while at the kitchen table in the July afternoon, and outside the mockingbird kept singing, and the stew was starting to smell exactly right. And Hazel Leland, who had grown up being told she was not quite enough, sat in the house her parents had built and held the hand of a man who had stood up in a room full of people who said nothing. And she thought, this is what it is supposed to feel like. After that, things changed in the way of things that have already changed and are simply being acknowledged. There was nothing dramatic about it. He moved from the second bedroom to the first, and she found that his steadiness was the same at close range as it was at a distance, which was something she had not been sure about until she knew. He kissed her forehead first, that evening, and then her temple, and then properly, and she found that she had been right about all of it. They were not always easy with each other. She had a temper, and he had a stubbornness that was the quieter cousin of the same quality. And there were disagreements about cattle management and household expenses, and one memorable argument about whether the vegetable garden should be extended to the south or the north that lasted 3 days, and ended in a compromise that both of them were equally dissatisfied with and equally willing to accept. But underneath the disagreements was the thing that made the disagreements safe, the absolute knowledge, established by that first afternoon, that neither of them was going anywhere. The summer moved forward. The cattle herd grew as Edgar made arrangements with Jacob Brennan to purchase 3 additional heads, and the east pasture filled out, and the fence he had repaired held against the July rains. Clara came out for Sunday dinners most weeks, and she and Edgar had developed a friendship of their own that was conducted primarily through good-natured arguments about things that neither of them would ever agree on, which made Hazel happy in a way that had something to do with family. August brought the dry heat that West Texas considers its particular gift to the world, and the work slowed to what could be managed in the cooler morning and evening hours. There was a county social in the 3rd week of August at the Dusty Creek Fairground, which was a field with a barn and some lanterns and a fiddle player, and Hazel wore the blue dress and her mother's pearl earbobs, and Edgar wore a clean white shirt and his good vest, and they danced, which she had not expected, and which turned out to be something he was genuinely good at in the uncomplicated way of someone who learned to dance young and never forgot. She said so. "My mother taught me," he said. She said a man who can dance makes a better impression at every important moment in his life. Smart woman. She was exceptional, he said, simply and without sadness, which meant the grief was old and well kept. She would have liked you. Hazel looked up at him. Why? Because you don't suffer nonsense and you fix things. He said this as a matter of fact, as a compliment in the same category as saying someone was a good shot or a reliable judge of weather. She found she liked compliments of this kind very much. They danced twice and then stood at the edge of the gathering with cider, watching the other dancers, and Hazel noticed that some of the people who had been in the Silver Spur in April were present at this social, and one or two of them caught her eye with the slightly uncomfortable look of people who have failed a test and know it. She did not give them the satisfaction of any particular acknowledgement. She had Edgar's arm under her hand, and the evening was warm and the fiddle was good. Burkett was there, the rancher who had expressed interest in Clara in the saloon. He nodded at Edgar with a stiff correctness that suggested he had some shame about his behavior in April, which was a start. Edgar nodded back with perfect neutrality, and that was the end of it. September came, and with it the first real conversation about what came next, not just the immediate management of the property, but the actual shape of the future. They had this conversation on the porch, in the way of the porch, which had become the place where the real things got said. The evening was cooling, which in September in Texas meant it was merely hot instead of unbearably so, and the sky was going all the colors it went in September, which were the best colors it went all year. "I want to stay here," Hazel said. She had been thinking about how to say this for a while. "Not just because it's my parents' land, because it's ours now and I think we could make something real of it. Expand the herd over the next few years, maybe put in a proper garden space, fix the north wall of the barn properly instead of the patch job. I think we could make it good." Edgar looked at the pasture. "I think so too." "Do you want to stay?" she said because she wanted to hear him say it. He looked at her. "There's nowhere else I want to be." The simplicity of it, the complete absence of drama or performance, reached her in the place between her ribs where she kept the things she was most afraid to want. "Good," she said. "Then we stay." They made plans that evening, practical and particular: the north barn wall by winter, a better chicken coop before the cold, 2 more head of cattle in spring if the finances allowed, a proper fence along the road. The plans felt solid in her hands, the way good plans do, and she kept thinking, "This is mine. This is ours." Not because someone assigned it, but because 2 people sat on a porch in September and agreed. October came with a cool north wind that reminded everything alive that winter was on its way, and the work shifted accordingly, laying in wood, winterizing the stock pond situation, tending to the roof over the main house, which had a suspicious spot on the east side that Edgar climbed up to examine one Saturday, and came down from with a list of materials and a timeline. Clara had by October become genuinely indispensable to Mrs. Hale's operation. She had a real talent with fabric and an eye for pattern, and Mrs. Hale had expanded her duties from basic mending to taking in actual dressmaking, which paid considerably better and gave Clara a satisfaction that was visible to anyone who looked. She had also met in October a young man named Thomas Walsh who worked at the telegraph office and had the mild, bookish manner of someone who had arrived in West Texas by accident and stayed because he liked the sky. He had begun coming into Mrs. Hale's shop on the flimsiest possible pretexts: a button that needed replacement, a minor tear in his work shirt, and Clara had taken to having an extra cup of tea ready when she heard his footsteps on the boardwalk. Hazel watched this development with the satisfaction of someone watching a garden come in that they had not planted, but had always hoped for. She told Edgar about it on the porch on a Wednesday evening, and he listened with the small contained smile she had learned to catalog. "Walsh is a decent man," Edgar said. "He's smart and he works hard. He helped me find a title search for the east pasture in the county records back in May without being asked. You never told me that. I forgot." She leaned against his shoulder because it was October and the evenings were cold, and she had discovered that leaning against Edgar's shoulder on the porch was one of her top 5 favorite things. "You're very good at quietly helping people." "I don't know about that. You stood up in a saloon." He was quiet for a moment. "That was different." "That was just someone needed to say something. No one else said anything. That's the part I've never entirely understood," he said, and she heard genuine puzzlement in his voice. "There were 12 men in that room. It wasn't complicated. It was just saying a thing that was obvious." "It changed everything," she said. He put his arm around her. "Well, I hope so." "It did," she said. "Believe me, it did." She meant her own life, which had turned from a transaction into something she recognized as hers. But she also meant Clara, who was sewing curtains for the telegraph office at Mrs. Hale's and having tea with Thomas Walsh. She meant Deputy Marsh, who had used the Calloway situation to begin paying more attention to the kinds of arrangements that were being made with women in the county without their real consent, which had already resulted in 2 more quiet interventions. She meant Pete the bartender, who had told Edgar 6 weeks after the saloon incident that he had been ashamed of himself that day and had been trying to figure out what to do with that. And Edgar had said simply, "The next time, say something. That's all, you just say something." And Pete had taken that seriously. One thing said out loud at the right moment. The winter settled in mild by Missouri standards, brutal by the standards of anyone who had not expected it. Edgar and Hazel worked the short days efficiently and spent the long evenings by the stove in the way of 2 people who have run out of reserve around each other and are simply themselves. She read to him sometimes, which she had started doing in November when she mentioned a book she'd borrowed from the school teacher, and he asked her to read him a passage, and then another one, and then they had simply continued for an hour and a half, and it had become a thing, along with the porch coffee and the Sunday dinners. He told her things in those evenings that she did not think he told many people. About the years between leaving Missouri and arriving in Texas, which had not been easy years, which had included poverty and bad decisions, and at least one winter that he described briefly as the worst winter of his life. And she understood from his tone that there were parts of it he would tell her eventually, and parts he had simply gotten past and did not need to revisit. She accepted this the way she had learned to accept the things he offered and the pace at which he offered them, which was steady and honest. She told him things too. The ones she kept in the back of her mind like objects stored in a high cupboard. The specific fear, growing up, of never being enough. Not ugly enough to be interesting, not pretty enough to be noticed, just not quite enough in all the ordinary ways that added up to being overlooked. The afternoon in the Silver Spur and the sound of the words, "Take the ugly one," and how they had not surprised her, which was the worst part of it. Not that someone had said it, but that she had expected someone to, that she had been waiting for that version of the situation to arrive. "It didn't surprise you," Edgar said very carefully. "No," she said. "That's what I'm telling you." He was quiet for a while. "Then I want you to know something. Tell me. The reason I stood up was not because I felt sorry for you. I want you to understand that clearly. It was not pity and it was not charity. It was, I looked at you in that room and I saw a woman who was getting something completely, obviously wrong in a room full of people who were going to let it happen, and I couldn't sit through that. And then I looked at you specifically and I thought," he stopped. She waited. "I thought, she is extraordinary. Exactly as she is. The way she's holding herself. The intelligence in her face. The complete lack of self-pity even in a situation designed to produce it. I thought that was the most impressive thing I'd seen in a long time." She looked at the fire in the stove. "You thought that in the Silver Spur," she said. "In the Silver Spur. While I was being offered like a land parcel." "Yes, Edgar, I know, the timing was terrible. I'm just telling you what the truth is." She looked at him. Her husband sitting across from her in the lamplight with his honest gray eyes and his matter-of-fact courage and his complete, inexplicable willingness to tell her the truth. "I think you might be the best person I've ever met," she said. He looked surprised. It was the first time she had seen him genuinely surprised, and she liked it very much. I don't know about that," he said. "I know about it," she said. "I'm very good at assessing things. You told me so." The contained smile appeared. She felt it in her chest like warmth. December and Christmas in the little church, which Hazel attended with Edgar on one side and Clara on the other, and Thomas Walsh 3 seats down looking at Clara with the transparent adoration of a man who has given up pretending otherwise. The Reverend Alcott gave a sermon that was, for once, not too long, and the choir sang adequately, and afterward there was a gathering at the church hall with dried apple cake and coffee, and the specific communal warmth of a small town in winter. She watched Edgar across the room, talking to Jacob Brennan about spring cattle plans, and she thought about the April afternoon and the saloon and how terrifying and impossible everything had seemed from that moment, and how much had happened since, and how little of it had been what she feared. She made her way to him across the room and took his arm, which she did sometimes now simply because she wanted to, without particular occasion or ceremony. He looked down at her with the expression she had learned to read over the past 8 months, the one that was only for her, that was quieter and warmer than his public expression, and that she considered among her most valuable possessions. "You're plotting something," he said. "You get a specific look." "I'm not plotting, I'm thinking." "About what?" "About how different this is from what I expected," she said. "Back in April." He covered her hand with his. "Better or worse than expected?" "Incomparably better," she said, without any drama, as a simple statement of fact, because that was how she had learned to say true things in this marriage. He squeezed her hand once. "For me as well." January of 1879 arrived with a cold that meant business, and they met it with adequate firewood and the knowledge of how to manage a homestead in a Texas winter, which is to say imperfectly but successfully. The cattle required more attention in the cold, and there were mornings when the stock pond froze at the surface and needed breaking, and they did these things as a matter of course, in the established rhythm of shared work that had become the architecture of their daily life. In January, Clara and Thomas Walsh became formally engaged, which was not a surprise to anyone but Clara, who had apparently managed not to think too carefully about where the TN pretextual button situation was heading. Thomas asked her on a Tuesday evening outside Mrs. Hale's shop, and Clara came to the homestead the following Sunday with a color in her face that had nothing to do with the cold and an expression that Hazel had not seen on her sister's face before, a particular radiant calm, like someone who has just understood something. "He asked me," Clara said, which was not strictly necessary as information. "I know," Hazel said. "Come inside." They sat in the kitchen and Clara told her all of it in the specific and thorough manner of someone who needs to say the story out loud several times before it becomes fully real. And Hazel listened and made tea and smiled in the way she rarely smiled, the full one, the unguarded one. Edgar came in from the cold toward the end of the retelling, stamped his boots at the door, took in the scene at the kitchen table, poured himself coffee and said to Clara, "Walsh finally worked up the nerve." Clara laughed, which was exactly the right response. "Did everyone know before I did?" "Yes," Edgar said pleasantly and sat down. They had a proper supper that evening, all 3 of them, and it felt like what it was, which was a family having a celebration. Hazel looked at her husband and her sister across the table and thought of her parents and felt the grief and the gratitude at the same time, which was how grief works when you are also genuinely happy, and she let both of them exist without trying to choose between them. February brought something else, which was the quiet, early morning certainty, arriving on a cold Tuesday before dawn, that something in her body had changed. She lay still in the gray dark and counted days in her head with the focused arithmetic of a woman who is both hoping and slightly terrified. And then she lay still some more and listened to Edgar breathing beside her, and thought about what she wanted to say and how. She told him over breakfast. She told him simply, the way she told him things without preamble or excessive decoration. She watched his face as she said it. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her across the table. His expression moved through several things in quick succession: surprise, and then something that opened up in his face like light through a door. And then he stood up and came around the table and put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt him holding on with the kind of care that is different from ordinary embracing, gentler and more serious. "Hazel," he said, just her name against her hair. "I know," she said. How are you feeling?" "Steady," she said. "Mostly steady." "We'll do this well," he said. "We'll figure it out, we'll do it well." "I know we will," she said, and she did know. She knew because she had 8 months of evidence and she was good at assessing things. The spring of 1879 came around to meet the spring of the year before, but everything was different. The east pasture was greener. The fence line was sound. The barn was solid. The herd had grown to 23 head and was healthy. The garden was planted with purpose and a plan. Clara was in the final stages of planning her wedding to Thomas Walsh, which was to take place in May, and the little church on Main Street was going to see considerably more sentiment in that ceremony than it had in the brief, practical one of April 1878. Hazel was 5 months along by the time the apple blossoms came, and she was fine, which she told people when they asked, with the flat certainty of a woman who refuses to be managed. She was working still, at a reduced pace and with modifications, and Edgar had developed a very specific expression that appeared whenever she picked up anything he considered too heavy, which she found both irritating and quietly endearing. "I'm pregnant, not incapacitated," she told him one morning when he appeared at her elbow as she was carrying a sack of feed to the chicken coop. "I know that," he said, and took the sack anyway. "Edgar, I just happened to also be going to the chicken coop. You were going to the north field. I changed my mind." She let him take the sack and did not say anything, but she looked at the sky with an expression that she allowed herself because he was looking at the ground. It was an expression of absolute, helpless, complete love for this specific man, and she did not need to show it because she did not need to perform it for anyone. It was simply hers. Clara's wedding to Thomas Walsh was in May, as planned, and it was everything the April ceremony of the year before had not been, full of flowers and guests, and the kind of easy happiness that comes from two people who chose each other freely and without crisis. Hazel stood beside Clara as her matron of honor, 8 months along and deeply unconcerned with the social awkwardness this might produce for anyone. And Thomas looked at Clara with such clear and uncomplicated devotion that Reverend Alcott had to ask him twice to stop anticipating the words. Edgar stood in the second row and caught Hazel's eye at one point during the ceremony, and held her gaze for a moment with the quiet communication of two people who share a private language. And she thought about April of last year and the saloon and the terrible helpless stillness of that room, and how the whole chain of everything good in her life right now, this church, this day, her sister's happiness, the child growing inside her, had started with a single chair scraping back from a corner table. One person saying something when it needed to be said. She kept her face composed through the ceremony and cried a little at the reception, which she blamed on her condition, and Edgar handed her his handkerchief without commentary, which she appreciated. August and the baby. It happened on a hot Sunday morning in the second week of August, and Hazel was not afraid, which surprised her, or rather she was afraid, but the fear was manageable in the way of things that are real and present rather than imagined. Clara was there, and the midwife, Mrs. Reyes, who was a calm, practical woman with steady hands and 20 years of experience, and Edgar was there as much as was considered appropriate for the time, which was to say in the outer room, and she could hear him absolutely not pacing, because he was the kind of man who would not let himself pace, which told her more about his state of mind than pacing would have. The baby arrived in the morning and announced itself at volume, which Mrs. Reyes said was a very good sign, and Clara cried, and Hazel held the baby with shaking arms and looked at this small, extraordinary new person with the feeling of someone who has expected something ordinary and received something staggering. She called for Edgar. He came in and stood at the bedside and looked at the child in her arms, and she saw his face do the thing she had seen in February at the kitchen table, open up, all the carefully maintained composure simply giving way to something unguarded and astonished, and she thought, there it is. There is what he looks like when he stops managing himself. "Come here," she said. "Look." He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the baby into his arms, and she watched him hold his son, a boy, pink and loud and newly arrived, with the terrified, focused tenderness of someone holding the most important thing they have ever been handed. "A boy," he said. A boy, she confirmed. What do you want to call him? She had been thinking about this for months. James, she said. After my father. Edgar looked at her. James Slater, he said, trying the name. Yes, he looked back at the baby. Hello, James. James Slater, who did not yet have any thoughts on the matter, continued to be loud about his opinions. The autumn of 1879 was the best autumn Hazel could remember, which was saying something, because she had loved the previous autumn very much. But there was something about this particular season, the cooling air, the golden light, the property that had become genuinely productive, the child who had begun doing new things on what seemed like a daily basis, the man who came in from the field every evening and first kissed her, and then went to find James. That made the ordinary beauty of it feel abundant. Clara and Thomas came for Sunday dinners, as before, and Thomas had become part of the family with the easy naturalness of someone who was always going to belong there. He and Edgar had developed a genuine friendship, conducted partly through chess games at the kitchen table on winter evenings, and partly through the shared understanding of two men who had been received into the Leland family by their own choosing and were grateful for it. James was 3 months old and making his opinions known about everything when Hazel and Edgar sat on the porch on an October evening, and she thought about what she wanted to say and let herself say it simply, which was how she said things now. I want to tell you something, she said. Tell me. I used to think that the life I was going to have was the life I'd gotten. That there was a shape to it that had been decided and I was going to fit into that shape as best I could. She looked at the pasture, at the fence line Edgar had built, at the cattle moving in the late afternoon light. I was standing in that saloon waiting for the shape to snap shut around me. I was just waiting for it. He was looking at her steadily. You changed the shape, she said. You just stood up and changed it. Not with any particular drama, not trying to be anyone's hero, just because you looked at a room doing something wrong and you could not sit through it. And everything after that, everything has been mine in a way that I don't think I understood things could be mine. He was quiet for a moment, then, you did that yourself. I started a thing, maybe, but everything that's here, he gestured, taking in the property and the house and the evening, you built that. We built it together, but you would have built something like it regardless. You're that kind of person. I wouldn't have built it with you, she said. No, he agreed. That part specifically required me to stand up. She laughed, which startled her, and he smiled, the full one, the one she still, a year and a half later, felt in her chest like something lighting. Edgar, she said, Hazel, I love you. She had said it before, had started saying it in the winter, when the wall between them had fully come down. But she said it now with the particular weight of someone who means it to encompass everything. The chair scraping back from the table, and the east pasture in the spring, and every morning with coffee in the pot, and the porch conversations and the fence arguments and the winter nights by the stove and James in August and all of it. All of the specific accumulated evidence of a life being built by two people who chose each other. I love you, he said, and it landed exactly the same way, equally full, equally weighted. James made a sound from inside the house, the particular sound he made when he was about to graduate from preliminary complaints to full announcement, and they both turned their heads at the same moment, and then looked back at each other, and the small private smile passed between them. I'll get him, Edgar said, and stood. She watched him go inside and listened to the evening settle around the property, the cattle quiet in the pasture, the horses in the barn, the post oak rustling in the cooling air. And she sat with the fullness of it, which was the specific fullness of a life that has become genuinely, recognizably good. Inside, Edgar's voice, low and patient, talking to James in the way he always talked to him, matter of fact and gentle, telling him about the evening, describing the sounds of the property. She had heard him do this dozens of times now, and it still reached her in the same place, the unguarded place she kept behind the practical exterior that the world saw. She went inside. The years that followed were ordinary in the best sense, which is the sense that means filled with real living. The homestead grew. By 1881, The herd was 32 head, and there was a proper enclosed garden and a new chicken coop, and the barn had been fully repaired and expanded. Edgar had a reputation in the county as an honest man and a capable rancher, and Hazel had one as a woman who could be trusted to give you a direct answer to any question, which in West Texas was worth a great deal. Clara and Thomas had a daughter in 1880 whom they named Eliza, after Clara and Hazel's mother, and Sunday dinners became louder and more cheerful, and contained increasing numbers of people who were related by blood and choice, and the particular bonds that form when people go through things together. James was walking, and then running, and then talking with the absolute confidence of a small person who has two parents paying close attention to everything he does, which in his case produced a child who was curious and steady, and had his mother's amber-green eyes and his father's gray cloud expression when something was not quite right. There was a second child in 1882, a daughter this time, born in March when the first green things were coming up, whom they named Eleanor after Edgar's mother, because Hazel had asked about her and Edgar had told her, and she had said simply, "Then we name her Eleanor," and that had been that. Eleanor arrived with the characteristic Slater quality of knowing exactly what she wanted, and the characteristic Leland quality of making sure everyone around her was also all right, and she was magnificent from the beginning. The town of Dusty Creek grew around them. There was a new schoolhouse by 1881, which was its own building now instead of doubling as the church, and a proper doctor had arrived, a young man named Porter from Austin who had more education than experience, but was willing to learn from the people who had managed without him. The telegraph line was expanded. New families came and settled and became neighbors. The territory was changing in ways that were sometimes difficult and sometimes remarkable, and through all of it the Slater homestead was a particular kind of constant, the people who had been there long enough to remember what it had been, and who were invested enough in what it was becoming to work toward something better. Hazel never forgot the silver spur. She did not think about it often, but when she did, she thought about it clearly, without flinching. It had been a degrading moment. The words had been unkind in the specific, surgical way of words that are meant to reduce a person to their least, to strip them of complexity and dignity, and replace them with a simple, dismissible label. Take the ugly one. As if she were a thing, as if a thing were all she was. She thought about what it meant that a room full of people had let it happen. She thought about Deputy Marsh and the quiet interventions he had made after. She thought about Pete the bartender who had told Edgar, 2 years after the fact, that he had changed how he handled himself in situations where someone needed a person to say something, and had said so at a town meeting in a way that had started an actual conversation. She thought about her daughter, who was learning to walk in the spring of 1883, and her son, who was asking her why things worked the way they worked with the relentless curiosity of a child who has been taught that questions are good, and she thought about what she would tell them when they were old enough for this story. She would tell James, "You do not sit when someone needs you to stand." She would tell Eleanor, "Your worth is not a matter for anyone else to determine." She would tell them both, "Your father got up from a table in a saloon in 1878, and everything good in your life traces back to that moment, which was not complicated. It was just a man deciding to say a thing that was obvious. The world is full of obvious things waiting for someone to say them." One evening in the summer of 1883, with James nearly 4 years old and Eleanor nearly 1, Hazel sat on the porch, the old familiar porch, worn at the railing from years of 2 people leaning, and watched the sunset go through its repertoire of golds and pinks, and the particular deep orange that West Texas reserves for special occasions. Edgar came out and stood at the railing, coffee in hand, in the way she had been watching him stand at this railing for 5 years now. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "Everything," she said. He sat down beside her. "That's a lot to be thinking about. It's been a lot of everything." He looked at the pasture, at the evening light on the grass, at the cattle moving slow and content along the fence line. "It has," he said, "and I wouldn't change a day of it." She looked at him, her husband, this man she had not chosen on a Tuesday afternoon in April and had chosen in every moment that followed, this steady, quiet, deeply good person who had stood up in a room of silence and given everything that came after its starting place. "Edgar," she said. "Hazel. Thank you." He looked at her. "For what? You know for what?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then, you would have been extraordinary regardless." "Maybe," she said, "but I'm glad I got to be extraordinary with you." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and the evening settled across the Slater homestead in the gentle, unhurried way of a life that has found its shape. Not the shape that closes in around a person against their will, but the open kind, the kind with room to breathe and grow and fill with everything that matters. Inside the house, James made a sound that suggested he was awake and had opinions, and Alina made a sound in response, and somewhere in the yard the horses shifted in the barn, and the evening star appeared over the flat horizon of the Llano Estacado, sharp and unwavering above the darkening plain. Hazel Slater sat on her porch in West Texas in the summer of 1883 and knew, with the clear-eyed certainty of a woman who has learned to assess things well, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, with exactly the life she had not known she wanted, until it had been offered to her by a man willing to stand up and say something when it needed to be said. The mockingbird in the post oak launched into its evening performance, cycling through every song it knew, and the stars came out one by one over the flat open land, and the porch held them as it always had, and the night was warm and full, and everything was resolved and good.